So after many years of living in this cold climate, a couple, somewhat older than I, decided that they were going to move to Florida. So they sold their house, they packed up their belongings, and they moved to Florida, leaving their son and their daughter back here in Buffalo. As time went on, the son and the daughter visited less and less for a lot of different reasons. But they came to Florida very infrequently, if at all. So one day, the son receives a phone call from his father. His father, sounding very hesitant, says, "I have something I need to tell you." "Yeah?" And the son, kind of guessing that something was wrong, said, "Is Mom okay?" "Yeah, she's fine. But this is really hard to say. And I haven't told anyone yet. You're the first one. Your mother and I are going to get a divorce." "What, Dad? You can't do that. You've been married over 35 years. You can't do that. How come? You've put up with everything for all these years. What do you mean you're getting a divorce?" I know, but my mind is made up." "Why?" My mind is just made up." "Now, would you do me a favor and tell your sister I just can't tell her? And by the way, don't say anything to your mother yet. I haven't talked to her yet. Going to see a lawyer next week." Dad, don't do anything rash. Look, I'll be on the next plane to Florida to talk to you about this face to face. This isn't something we should talk about over the phone." "Okay. I'll talk to you later." So he hung up. And not 2 hours later, the daughter called. Dad, what do you think you're up to? Are you nuts? After all these years? Dad, don't do anything. I've got tickets for my brother and I. We'll be on the plane tomorrow morning, and we'll be there by early afternoon. Please, don't do anything until we've had a chance to talk about this." "All right, but my mind is made up. I've got the appointment with the lawyer." Dad, don't do anything until we get there." "All right." So he hung up the phone, and he turned to his wife and said, "Well, that worked this time. They'll be here for Christmas. I don't know what we're going to do about Easter." Did I do it right? I didn't look at her. I don't tell jokes well. So we talked about this last night, whether or not I was going to try and do that. Divorce is not something we should take lightly. And if any of you want to come up here and preach this sermon, please feel free. She got worried yesterday because I didn't show up until just before 5 o'clock, and she's running through her head, how am I going to preach on this text? Jesus, I'm sure, doesn't like to talk about divorce either. This is a tough subject because how many in this room, raising your hand, how many of you have been touched in some sort of close way by divorce somewhere in your family? Okay? If you expand that to your friends and acquaintances, how many of you have been touched by divorce in some way? How many of you have been in some way hurt by divorce? That's the problem, folks. That's the problem. Divorce never leaves people intact. The Pharisees come to Jesus, and they're actually asking a question about the law. These are the ones that are always trying to trip Jesus up on technicalities, okay? So they're asking a legal question. Is it legal for a man to divorce his wife? Now, let me stop here for just a moment and explain to you a little about divorce in Jesus' day. Men could divorce their wives. Women could not divorce their husbands. Okay? And there are two schools of thought going on in Jesus' day about that. One school of thought said the only reason a man could divorce his wife was for sexual inappropriateness. The other school of thought said a man can divorce his wife anytime he is dissatisfied with her in any way. So if she burned breakfast, if she put too much salt on my dinner, if she looked or spoke to a man in public, if she didn't let her hair, put her hair up appropriately when she went out the door, he could just say, I'm done. In the presence of one witness, he could just say to her, that's it. And the Pharisees come to Jesus and say, so is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? And later, after the conversation, Jesus and the disciples are in a house, and the disciples are going, you want to explain this a little more? And don't miss, let me read it to you because I don't want you to miss the impact of what Jesus says. Then in the house, the disciples asked him again about this matter. He said to them, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. Commits adultery against her. That's radical. But listen to the next sentence. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, commits adultery against him. Or she commits adultery, I'm sorry. Did you catch that? He just turned the whole table upside down. Is it legal for a man to divorce his wife? And Jesus says, you know something? If he does, he commits adultery. Now, that wasn't possible in Jesus' day. It was only the women that could commit adultery. Don't ask me. I don't understand that one either, because it always takes two to tango. But somehow they got the understanding that only a woman could commit adultery. Now, if he divorces her and marries another, guess who committed the adultery? He did, against her. Women were not protected in that way, in any way, shape, or form. And then he goes on to say, and if she divorces him, big, radical change of events. She divorces him? Not possible. But Jesus says, well, it is. And if she does, guess what? She commits adultery. Now, adultery is one of those commandments, right? 10 of them. And actually, I just had a conversation with Lucas in confirmation Sunday school this morning about those 10 commandments. God gave them to us because we need rules and regulations, because if we live outside of rules and regulations, what happens? Chaos, right? If there were no street signs, stop signs, street lights, what would happen on the road? Would people be courteous? One would hope, but no guarantees. Okay? Chaos happens when there are no rules and regulations. God sets up the boundaries for a purpose, to protect us. Because he knows that if we step outside that boundary, guess what's going to happen? People are going to get hurt. And how many of you know that pain, that hurt of divorce? Whether it happened to you, or whether it happened to one of your kids, but you really liked your daughter-in-law, so now what do I do? Or you really liked your son-in-law's family, and now they're divorced, and how am I supposed to relate to them? Or the one that Randy came home with the other day and said, you will not believe this. A divorced B, A married C, and B has a girlfriend D. And they all came to church and sat in the same pew together. Now the congregation is saying, how do we relate to this? How do we handle this? Divorce always hurts somebody along the way. Now, I am also going to say to you quite openly that there are times that divorce is needed. There are times when abuse happens, when relationships are destructive and beyond repair. And divorce is the best of bad options. You know situations like that. Moses, according to Jesus, allowed a man to write his wife a certificate of divorce because of our hardness of heart, because of our stubbornness and our sin. That still exists in our world, doesn't it? But divorce is never a good option. Sometimes it's the best of bad options. Divorce always hurts. And Jesus goes back to the very beginning. He goes back past Moses to where God created the earth. And he quotes that passage from Genesis that Meredith read this morning. This is what God intended in the beginning of time. That a man should leave his mother and father and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one. That's what God intended. That's what God still intends. But because of our hardness of heart, relationships do fall apart. And all of you have been touched by this in some way, shape, or form. You know the pain of divorce. Did you listen to the video this morning about the man who reclaimed things that were broken, that others tossed out as garbage, stuff that looked ugly, and he picked up that wood, and with a lot of love and care, he created something amazing out of it, didn't he? That's exactly what God does with our hardness of heart. With the pain of divorce, what God does is take something that's very ugly and very painful, and he restores us to wholeness and health. Is there life beyond divorce? You betcha. You betcha. And there's life beyond divorce because of God's grace and forgiveness. God is not a God of judgment. He lays down those rules and regulations for us because he knows darn well that when we step outside, we get hurt or someone else gets hurt. And he loves us enough to say, I don't want that. When two people make a commitment to one another, it is for a lifetime. But sometimes we step so far outside those boundaries that we need a divorce. Now, let me say it again. It's never a good option. Sometimes it's the better of bad options. Please hear that. Do not step out of a marriage because I'm just sick of this. That sounds like that one school of thought in Jesus' day that says, well, if I don't like the way she made breakfast this morning, I'll just get rid of her. Careful. That's not what it says. Jesus takes marriage very seriously. It takes a lot of work. Those of you who have been in it, you know. You thought you were in love when you got married, right? And guess what? You found out love's by a whole different definition 10 years later, 20 years later, 50 years later. You know darn well that it takes a lot of work to keep it together. It takes a lot of grace. It takes a lot of forgiveness. It takes a lot of turning to God and letting him make my ugly wood self into a beautiful table. Long ago, and I don't remember when, but I put on the signboard, if you want a good marriage, be a good spouse. If you want a good marriage, be a good spouse. But if the relationship is so broken, divorce is an option. But hear the grace of God that restores those with broken relationships to wholeness and health. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Yeah, it is. Is it lawful for a woman to divorce her husband? Yes, it is. Is it what God intended? No. In the beginning of creation, his intention was that we be in community, in relationship with one another. What happens when we break those relationships? God forgives, and God restores, and God heals. Amen.